Hello and welcome to State of Play on Mint Press News, a bi-weekly editorial geopolitical news and analysis show hosted by myself, Greg Stoker. Again, the video quality issues are perennial. Basically, I'm stuck with a crappy internet at this location, but we're just going to plow ahead because I know some of y'all just listen on audio. And as the doomsday clock inched to the right over the weekend, with a heightened risk of a flashpoint for a hot world war on the Ukrainian front. Yes, we are pretty much in a cold to warm World War III right now. And I'm not even kidding. We don't have much time for pleasantries. To that end, get ready for my mandatory plug. Strap in, because Mint Press News is a small independent newsroom demonetized on literally every platform with no corporate sponsors. So if you like the analysis and the guests on this show and the investigative watchdog reporting of the staff writers at Mint Press, consider supporting us on Patreon. $5 a month really does go a long way to keeping this ship afloat. And if you're being lambasted, downtrodden, and nickeled and dimed by late-stage finance capitalism, we get it. We're just glad you're here. But if you could like and comment, it'll push this further into the algorithm so it gets exposed to more people. If you're coming to this show through the Colonial Outcast podcast, consider subscribing to Mint Press News. Okay, plug complete. And today we're going to be talking about how serious this Russia, NATO, US, Ukraine situation is, and incorporate a lot of cloak and dagger drama, leaked intelligence, NATO stay-behind operations, nuclear brinksmanship, and less sexy stuff like how the Biden administration will be remembered as one of the most reckless, violent, foolhardy administrations in U.S. history. And if you think Trump's will be any better, less violent, less warlike, which is something he campaigned on, and like less foolhardy, well, good luck with that. So in case you guys actually had like a weekend and you didn't pay attention to geopolitics, look, it's Monday, November 18th, back to the working week and back to paying attention to everything. If you have been taking mental health breaks from the insanity that is unfolding in these times. Biden is allowing Ukraine to strike Russia with long-range U.S. missiles, okay? The weapons are likely to be initially employed against Russian and North Korean troops in defense of Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region of Western Russia, U.S. officials have said. Okay, so if you guys don't recall, August 6th, the Ukrainian army launched an invasion of the largely undefended Kursk region in Russia, overwhelmed defenses, took hundreds of square kilometers, and they've been slowly losing ground since August. And so, again, these ATACMS, which we'll talk about in a second, these long-range ballistic missiles are going to be meant to protect those troops from Russian and North Korean now advances. So we said in August that the Kursk offensive was going to be a strategic blunder. I think we're kind of vindicated because while they've been losing in Kursk, they've also lost significant amount of territory in the Donbass. 5 towns were taken recently. A lot of desertions happening in the Ukrainian army. And we kind of all saw this coming. So Mr. Biden's decision to basically go weapons free with these long range ballistic missiles into Russian territory is a major change in U.S. policy. The choice has divided his advisors, and his shift comes 2 months before President-elect Donald J. Trump takes office, having vowed to limit further support for Ukraine, and allowing the Ukrainians to use the long-range missiles known as Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS, came in response, apparently, to Russia's surprise decision to bring North Korean troops into the fight within its own sovereign territory. So essentially, with 2 months left in office, Biden is trying to do what he can to Trump-proof the war in Ukraine. Well, we're going to talk about that, whether that's true or not. Making sure all funds are allocated to the war before Trump can reallocate them at his discretion. And for the first time, authorized the Ukrainian military to use ATACMS to help defend its forces in the Kursk region. This is an inherent escalation. What does it mean? What does it risk? We usually do a live Q&A at the end. We have a lot to discuss today, so I can't promise that. We'll see what happens. So to that end, we are joined by Elina Xenofontos, an international law and globalization specialist. Most of her work has been oriented towards the economic underpinning of EU foreign policy objectives. She has worked with organizations such as SOMO, the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations in the Netherlands. Anyways, thanks for coming on again and taking the time to be here.
Thank you for having me. It's going to be an interesting conversation today.
Lot to cover. Yeah, this is not by any stretch of the imagination a simple issue. So before we start playing some news clippings and getting the audience up to speed, just wanted to read a little paragraph from a 4-hour-old Economist article titled, quote, Ukraine, excuse me, quote, Ukraine can at last use its American missiles inside of Russia. Very telling title. They've been pushing that particular publication has been pushing for that for quite a while. But however, two paragraphs in, it reads, quote, the decision will not dramatically change Ukraine's flagging fortunes on the front lines, though it will boost morale and strengthen the country's hand ahead of negotiations once Donald Trump returns to power. Unquote. Kind of some things to unpack there. Well, all of this seems incredibly tenuous, seeing that, you know, they wanted to use Kursk as a bargaining chip to get ground lost in the Donbass back, but it doesn't seem like always U.S. foreign policy and NATO policy has been, we'll just give them one more weapon. We'll just give them F-16 or like F-15s, F-16s. We'll give them HIMARS, and this will change the outcome of the war. It'll be a silver bullet. It's just bad strategy, I would argue. It's just straight up magical thinking. What are your initial thoughts about everything that's going on with President Biden's escalatory cleared hot order for these ATACMS?
All right. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack just with that question alone. The fact of the matter is there's been a lot of conversations with regards to the fact as well that this is Biden's last attempt before he leaves office to essentially secure American sort of support for the war in Ukraine in order to essentially target Russia and lock Trump into this particular sort of war. But the fact of the matter is, just 4 days ago, Trump and Biden had actually met. And these are conversations that you would have with the president-elect, including his cabinet. And the fact of the matter, it would appear that for the most part, there is a bipartisan alignment in this, and there is ample evidence to be able to prove this actual point. Now, the reasons for this, well, this boils down to the particular point of where we're at when it comes to U.S. imperialism and essentially sustaining global hegemony in order to preserve imperialism, and why the war in Ukraine requires escalation in order to achieve those means. And that's just sort of like a summary that we can then obviously sort of break down in a far more, I guess, intricate way.
Right. And before we get into that, I would like to play some news clippings just for context. But your point about locking Trump into the war, and how like that's probably not something they even have to do. But there is this idea that he is an anti-war candidate, which any critical examination of his last presidency and his current cabinet picks, who are all generally like neocon war hawks, it doesn't really bear out for any reasonable person. So, okay, I follow MAGA comment sections and message boards, and there is an overriding belief that all of this is to undermine the incoming president-elect Trump, plain and simple, who seeks to end the war in Ukraine, potentially turning it into a 20-year frozen conflict, which I'm sure we'll address in a bit. His plan to end it was just not end it. And the Biden administration is trying to do as much damage as they can before Trump takes office, to trap him, as you said, into continuing the war after Biden leaves office. However, I'm not sure there's going to be a huge policy shift because well, let's just look at how the media, and this is not, we're going to be looking at, I think, CBS, a clipping from CBS earlier this morning, and I wanted to focus on the liberal media, but the reporting and the pundits on Fox News are no different from what's going on here. So let's check it out.
And now by a former U.S. ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan, who served under the Biden and Trump administrations and is also a CBS News contributor and the author of the book Midnight in Moscow. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us. So President Biden had been hesitant to allow these strikes with long-range U.S.-made missiles before the election. So now that we're post-election, what changed, the politics or the war?
Well, I hope it's not politics, because a decision like this needs to be made based on the national security interests of the United States.
Okay, so right off the bat, we've got a pundit who's coming on here, a former U.S. ambassador, who's saying this. I hope this decision has nothing to do with politics. It's inherently problematic because obviously it does. This is all great power politics, but let's continue.
I think what was hinted at in the report that we just heard is that the increased escalation by Putin, bringing in North Korean troops, really solidifying this as a global conflict with troops from North Korea fighting in Europe. I think that was the last straw for the Biden administration.
So real quick, wanted to pause on there. So bringing North Korean troops to fight on Russian territory was an escalation. And really makes this solidifies this into a world war. Your response to that?
My response to that, okay, so first of all, we don't really have concrete evidence as to North Korean fighters in Russia. Secondly, even if we were to assume that, we don't even know the numbers. And third, the North Korean fighters that they're claiming are basically assisting the Russian military are based in Kursk, which is in Russia. Now, the fact of the matter is Russia, just like the entirety of the West, who have the collective military alliance of NATO and therefore are allies in a state of war, has the right to also have its own allies within any, within the construct of a military defense. And the fact that the West thinks that it's an escalation that Russia has in any way seeked some sort of assistance from North Korea, when in reality, Ukraine has not only been seeking assistance from NATO, but we also have evidence at this point that NATO, beyond the fact that they're providing weapons and military aid overall, but we have also seen foreign mercenaries from the United States, from the UK, from France, who have been fighting alongside the Ukrainian military. And even recently, there was a exclusive report by GRAYZONE, including leaked documents from the British, secret contractors in combination with the UK government, that have, it testifies to the fact that the British government have not only been training and funding the Ukrainian war against Russia, but they have been actively provoking the war in Russia and seek to perpetuate the war against Russia for their own gains, which we can get to in a little bit. So the fact that this war has become international, it has been international since 2022, because all NATO military sort of power, whether it's in the form, like I said, of even NATO officials within Ukraine, where we have evidence for that as well, including, again, in April of 2024, this year, we had leaked audio that was published by Russia, again, April 2024, with German military personnel, which are NATO military personnel, targeting and planning attacks against the Crimea Bridge in Ukraine, or what it is today, for example, the territories that are controlled by Russia. So this just goes to show the extent of Western involvement in the Ukraine-Russia war. And so now to turn around and say that having North Korean troops in Kursk, which is actually it's Russia, this is Russian territory, aiding in what Russia calls, an anti-terror operation, because they're treating the incursion into Kursk as an anti-terror operation, it's not only hypocritical, but it's utter nonsense, because this war has already been international, and it has been international mostly because of NATO and the totality of the West. So this just points, again, the hypocrisy and the excuses that the West gives in order to justify their constant provocation and escalation for war against Russia.
Yeah. First of all, I have seen a couple points. I have seen videos of North Korean
There are
troops
some videos.
drawing Russian equipment. I do think there are North Korean troops, and they're just like there are NATO troops in Ukraine. Yeah. My issue though is the complete double standard. First of all, like I'm not really interested in focusing on the origins of the war or really getting into great power politics. But bottom line is there's not an equal application. I mean, there's a massive hypocrisy here at play, and to say that it's completely Russia's fault, everything is justified, and now Ukraine has the ability to defend itself. Sure, cool, got it, sovereignty. But yes, it's reductive and hypocritical. And of course, this interview that we're watching on CBS is just a straight up corporate media propaganda piece. But we're going to continue.
I just want to add one last thing. I just want to add one last point. It's also important to remember that part of the reason this war even inaugurated in the first place was fundamentally because, Russia felt a security threat by the expansion of NATO and its borders, and particularly the possibility and prospects of Ukraine becoming a part of NATO and essentially placing NATO, which is an adversary, on its borders, and obviously weapons and, lethal weapons upon Russia's borders. And the NATO itself, like we said, is a military alliance of multiple states that did inaugurate, and with Russia, or at the time the Soviet Union, being a target for the existence of NATO in itself. And so it's very ironic now to see Western powers using the fact that Russia is seemingly using North Korean troops to say, well, this is an international conflict and this is unacceptable, but it's perfectly acceptable, and it's within the realm of Ukraine's rights to become part of NATO and to become part of this international military alliance that is a direct threat to Russia. You see, like you said, the double standards, but also the complete logical irrationality of what it is that they're arguing here.
Yeah, and NATO expansionism has been a problem long before the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I'll just leave that out there.
Does this risk a wider war?
Sure, but Putin has already made this a wider war. He started it on February 24th, 2022, when his missiles and troops crossed the border of Ukraine. They've been
Okay, so real quick, I just want to make this real point, not trying to get into a conversation about it, but when it comes to Western media propaganda, it always starts at the outbreak of hostilities. Within the context of Israel-Palestine, everything started on October 7th, and within the context of Ukraine-Russia, everything started in 2002.
Murdering opponents in Western cities, cyber attacks, potentially blowing up Western commercial aircraft. It's been one escalation after another by Putin. And in my opinion, it was about time that the United States gave the Ukrainians the ability to defend themselves more completely.
But, Mr. Ambassador, the reality is we don't have our own troops in harm's way at the moment in Ukraine. And Putin has warned not only that if we do this, allow Ukraine to use long-range U.S. missiles, it's akin to NATO being in the war, which would involve U.S. troops. He's also said that he would potentially arm U.S. adversaries with long-range missiles so that we're hit. That's worrying to a lot of people. How do you think he will actually respond, given these threats?
Well, he's got to have some response because he issued this so-called red line in September. To save face, he's got to do something. And he's already been arming adversaries of the United States and the West. We know that there are connections between Russia and the Houthis in Yemen, for example. So he's made these threats already. He's got to do something.
He's just throwing like pasta at the wall to see if it sticks at this point. But yeah.
But I believe it will be a response that the United States and its allies can manage. And this is something that the United States needed to do to help Ukraine defend itself. And that's all Ukraine is doing, defending itself, not attacking Russia.
When you have to say it like that, all they're doing, they're not doing that. It's like when you're asked a question and you're lying, it's like, did you do this? And if you just say no, it's more believable than saying no, absolutely, I did not do this. Yeah, I mean, he's giving talking points really significantly. And that's how all corporate media is portraying what's happening, this decision by the Biden administration. Of course, there's more criticism of this on platforms like Fox News, who take Trump at his word that he's going to end the war in Ukraine and stop funding for Ukraine and stop support of Ukraine. So they, again, see this as a direct challenge to the incoming Trump presidency. However, let's get Putin's response. It's in Russian, and I will translate for y'all. Just kidding. I don't know Russian. Let me clarify for the sake of precision. I will be reading captions for those listening on audio. Here we go. Journalist asks, in recent days, we have been discussing the topic that the Kiev regime will be able to strike deep into Russian territory with Western long-range ballistic missiles, and apparently the decision is either about to be made or apparently has already been made. And this is, of course, an extraordinary thing. I would like to ask you to comment on what is happening. Putin responds, there is an attempt to substitute concepts. Because we are not talking about allowing or prohibiting the Kiev regime from striking rural areas. It is already doing so, using drones and other means. So we say they're already striking inside Russia. Okay, but when it comes to using high-precision, long-range weapons of Western manufacture, it is a completely different story. The fact is that, as I've already said, and any expert will confirm, both here and in the West, the Ukrainian army is not capable of striking with modern high-precision long-range systems of Western manufacture. It cannot do this. Okay, well, you know, he's doing his own information operations. Sorry, but before we came on, I consulted with a former field grade artillery officer and a former field grade rocket artillery officer, and of course ATACMS are rocket artillery. Yeah, it would probably only take the Ukrainians a few weeks to get trained up in order to program targeting with ATACMS into Russia. It's actually not that complicated, and according to Reuters, they've had ATACMS there since April. There's no way to think that Ukrainians can't operate these systems. However, NATO troops might actually be doing it. I just want to say that is completely untrue. It's not based on any sort of expert knowledge that Ukrainians won't be able to do these things. And it's only like a couple months long training program for ATACMS proficiency. So just throwing that out there. However, they are getting targeting data from NATO and the West, which is another problem. We're seeing the same thing happen in Gaza and southern Lebanon. Let's continue. President Putin continues, this is possible only with the use of U.S. intelligence from satellites, which is true, which Ukraine does not have, which is also true. This data is only from satellites of your EU and United States, in general from NATO satellites. Correct. This is the first thing. The second, and very important, perhaps the key point, is that flight assignments for these missile systems can, in fact, only be entered by NATO servicemen. This is a talking point. This is not necessarily true based off of expert testimony. Ukrainian servicemen cannot do this. Of course, training programs exist. And therefore, the issue is not about allowing the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. The issue is about making a decision about whether NATO countries are directly participating in the military conflict or not. I mean, yes, even if Ukrainians were shooting the missiles, NATO is still directly involved in the conflict. I don't think there's any way you can mince words about that. If this decision is made, this would mean nothing other than the direct participation of NATO countries, the US, EU, in the war in Ukraine. This would be their direct participation, and this, of course, significantly changes the very essence of the conflict. That means they're fighting Russia, and if this is so, then bearing in mind the change in the very essence of the conflict, we would make an appropriate decision based on the threats that would be created for us. So still vague language, but I mean, they've leaked, like a Russian official said, like they're risking World War III by doing this. Now, there's an idea that these ATACMS could strike Russia. No, their declassified range is 300 kilometers. Unless you're shooting from inside Russia, Russia's like 500 miles away. So even their classified range, max range, which is further than 300 kilometers. They couldn't reach Russia. So I've seen that being floated. Sorry, Moscow. Excuse me. No, they definitely reach Russia. But yeah, so that's just not true at all. So what do you make of this? I know Putin, President Putin, has given red lines before. He seems to be using vaguer language here than he has previously. I guess I'm not seeing like the huge threat of escalation from this. So,
all right, so
if you can walk me through your reasoning about this.
All right, so this is the thing. I mean, with regards to the training, I'm not quite sure the extent of the training that they will need, the Ukrainian military personnel will need, but the fundamental problem is that the Ukrainian military is in a very dire state with a lot of desertions, and people are just not I guess though the soldiers that were initially trained in the front lines, specifically by the West, many of them have already unfortunately either been killed or their battalions have been destroyed. Now we're talking about civilians who, for the most part, are being dragged into this war, as we've seen a lot of video footage that's coming out from Ukraine. Either they're having their bank accounts frozen or using other arbitrary means in order to coerce Ukrainian men in order to be able to basically fight in the front lines of Ukraine. And these are the sorts of individuals who they're going to be effectively training to be able to exercise these operations, which is a massive risk in of itself, which is why I personally believe there's a higher chance you'll probably be using NATO personnel in order to actually secure efficient outcomes. Otherwise, you're just essentially probably going to be wasting yet more, I guess, long-range missiles into Russia, because I don't think I don't think they're going to be able to exercise as efficiently as necessary. This is my first point that I wanted to bring up. The second point with regards to why this is escalation, well, I mean, listen, it doesn't really matter if they can target within Moscow per se, but from the moment that if they're able to use long-range missiles, they can start targeting military infrastructure in other parts of Russia that are fundamental storage rooms, ammunition depots of the Russian military, and also this begins to terrorize other regions within Russia and the Russian civilian population. And the objective here is to try to undermine Putin, and to undermine Putin not only internally, but also among his allies, which, again, if we were to go back to the GRAYZONE article that was recently published with the leaked the leaked documents of UK personnel discussing explicitly why they want to prolong a war with Ukraine, not a winnable war, but a war essentially that would humiliate and break Putin and have Putin overthrown, so as to then go into Russia and impose what they call in their leaked documents the post-Putin Marshall Plan, once Russia is in essentially a state of chaos. So even if it's not going to particularly strike Moscow, that's not really the objective. The objective is to start militarily striking key regions inside Russia and terrorizing the civilian population, and in doing so, therefore, to undermine Putin internally, but also externally, and to weaken Russia so far as is possible. And in doing so, perhaps try to gain more territories back for Ukraine within Ukraine. This is sort of, I guess, in a nutshell, like a more, synopsized evaluation of what the agenda is here, but not necessarily to hit within Moscow. I mean, Russia is a massive country. There's many other key regions that they could target that could become a problem. And again, undermining Putin for the Russian population and generating fear within the Russian population and turning the Russian population against this war, as well as obviously Putin. I mean, this is part of the Western strategy. We're seeing the same thing happen in Lebanon. We're seeing the same thing. I mean, this is exactly what they're exercising, what the Israelis are exercising in the Gaza Strip. And this is pretty much the modus operandi of the West. It's a form of collective terror and a means to undermine a government or an establishment or any sort of leadership of any particular movement. So this is, I guess, the objective. And I also wanted to quickly go back to Trump, but I don't know if we want to say something first before I get into that.
Well, yeah, I mean, both sides have both sides, both Russia and Ukraine, have implemented collective punishment and targeting of civilian areas for sure. You know, now that winter's coming on, Russia's going to do what they have been doing for the past couple winters, which is to target the power grid and, you know, other places as well. Yeah, so they mobilize these words, terrorism, etc., and you know we could get into that, but yeah, I do think the central linchpin of like what this conflict is going to look like going forward, again, even if they use ATACMS on Russian military depots, I don't see how that's going to cause a nuclear escalation. I'm seeing a lot of like sensationalist videos on, you know, YouTube talking about how this is like another form of nuclear brinksmanship. I'm just not convinced that it is, based off of President Putin's vague language about a response, based on the nature that ATACMS aren't going to change the dimensions of this conflict. They're not going to change the strategic situation on the ground. Russia's still going to be in a very strong position, even if they take some hits from ATACMS. So I just, before we move on to what this looks like on Trump, I guess I just have to say, like, for the record, categorically, I don't see how this is going to be like a World War III escalation. I think there's a lot of sensationalism going around.
It just depends on how Ukraine is going to be using these long-range missiles, what they plan on targeting, if they start hitting civilian infrastructure, which is another tactic that they'll probably use, and how this is going to manifest with regards to, obviously, the Russian population's particular stance on the war. And like I said, it's all about undermining Putin. This is what they're going to try to do. I mean, like Putin rightfully stated, there have already been attacks inside Russia systematically for the last 2 years, particularly in agricultural areas with drones and other sort of more, I guess, less effective weapons. Let's just put it like that. However, if now we're going to have long-range missiles targeting more freely into Russian territory, it depends on what kind of targets they're going to actually hit and how this is going to impact the overall, I guess, sort of the Russian civilian population psyche when it comes to this particular war. But most notably, and I think this is what Putin is he's trying to clarify in this particular interview that we've just seen, it's the fact that although we've already known that NATO has been directly involved in this war for pretty much since the beginning and prior, if we're being very honest about it, in many ways, it was also the instigator of this particular conflict. Having now, further direct, I guess, involvement and more openly professed involvement in the forms of allowing Western long-range missiles to be hitting inside Russian territory, perhaps maybe hitting even civilian infrastructure. And obviously we do, and we both accept that, you know, using even the satellites, these are EU and US and UK satellites that are going to be used to give the sort of information that the Ukrainians need to be able to target these particular regions. This is an escalation, because now you have the collective nations of NATO, or like specific nations within NATO, that are using intelligence data and satellites to actually help Ukraine target particular infrastructure. And again, we don't know how Ukraine is going to actually use this within Russia. This means that, militarily speaking, Russia then has a right to begin sort of reacting accordingly, which would mean maybe even targeting NATO structures within neighboring countries if they're perceived as some sort of threat. So it is to an extent an escalation, and it just depends at this point, I guess, on the details. I guess the devil's in the detail. Where is Ukraine going to strike? How is this going to manifest? And then seeing how Russia is obviously going to respond. But from what I've seen, from what Putin has said in the past over the course of the last few months, first of all, I mean, he said that he will actually start arming, adversaries to the West with long-range missiles, and possibly targeting Western units, strategic units within the region. This was something that he mentioned, I think it was in June of this year. And yes, obviously, he also reserved the rights to use nuclear weapons. I mean, he did say this was several months ago. This is even if non-nuclear countries if the non-nuclear countries become a threat to Russia via the use of nuclear countries, they reserve the right to be able to act accordingly. So, I mean, he has made some rather lucid points over the last few months. It's not like he hasn't really covered it. But But yes, the devil's in the detail, really. It's just we have to see how Ukraine's now going to use the long-range missiles.
Well, the thing is, the bottom line, I guess from my perspective, like Russia, sure, they could have they could make an argument for having a right to escalate and defend themselves, but like they don't really need to. Like Western strategy has not, NATO strategy has not over the past, and this will bring us into the Trump, changed or evolved at all. It's just like more sanctions, more loosening of weapons restrictions, more aid, with the like unreal, hoping against hope that a popular revolution against Russia, against Putin would happen in Russia, like a palace coup, or at least damage to the long-term, Russian imperial project. And the idea, and this was kind of reflected in some of the leaked documents that the from British intelligence services, or their targeting cell, this Project Alchemy, had going on. And we'll link the article and the documents in the description. But yeah, it was, let's just keep Ukraine fighting for as long as possible, and eventually this will happen. Well, it's not going to happen. The SWIFT banking system has kind of been defeated, or it will be eventually, because of like the billions and billions of dollars of Russian assets that were illegally stolen. And now other countries and BRICS are like looking at the sanctions that the U.S. levies against hundreds of other nations, and they're like, okay, we need an alternative. They have an increasingly secure security relationship with Iran, and definitely now North Korea. North Korea is, which I believe is actually sending troops into Russia. Yeah. So look, the Western strategy has completely collapsed. And will it change? Will it adapt under Trump? That is the salient question for the second half of this episode. What ideas do you have about this?
Right. So there's multiple things. With regards to will it escalate or not, I think and I'm going to connect it to Trump now. The Western approach here has been rather simple. It's just this gradual escalation. Every time there's always something a little bit more, as you rightfully stated. Whether it'll be successful or not is a different story. But what needs to be understood is that that escalation is not going to stop, not even now, with basically allowing Ukraine to use long-range missiles deeper within Russia. The next minute, I mean, within several months, we'll probably see a different sort of escalation, even when Trump comes into power. And the reason I say this is that when you look at Trump's sort of history, I mean, this is not the first time, as you said in the intro, where Trump has essentially promised that he's going to basically back out of all the wars and put America first. And this is sort of his rhetoric, and that's what he capitalizes on with regards to his supporters, for the most part, who are tired of the interventionist policies of the United States and want to focus more so on their own economic conditions and material conditions at home. And that's sort of the supporting base that Trump has had. Yet, even in his first presidency, we saw that he was trying to escalate with Iran with the killing of Soleimani. Then we also saw that essentially he found opportunities to be able to essentially invade and occupy a third of Syria. He basically occupied the oil-rich territories of Syria, specifically in order to sponge Syria of its natural resource income, so as to again generate the sort of economic conditions to overthrow Assad, among the many other conditions and material conditions that the United States and the West have generally been using in order to kind of overthrow Assad, including sort of funding of mercenaries and other so-called opposition groups, which are questionable opposition groups. And Trump actually played a very significant role in that. In addition to that, in 2019, it was actually under Donald Trump that Ukraine was given the first okay to begin arming Ukraine with lethal weapons. Up to $1 billion was spent or given to Ukraine to basically arm them with lethal weapons in preparation for war with Russia. So it was actually under the Trump administration. And is this going to change now? Well, not only is his cabinet very war hawkish, as we've already established, even the rhetoric that they're stating, well, they want to focus more so in China and possibly in Western Asia, as opposed to the Project Ukraine. there's some fundamental issues here, because Trump's, I guess, proposal to deal with this issue is, as you've also kind of outlined, but we can sort of get into the nuances here a little bit, is to basically offer Russia a 20-year freeze in the conflict. And that 20-year freeze in the conflict will bring sort of British troops and other sort of Western troops to guard essentially a buffer zone that's going to be established within the newly sort of taken territories, territories that Russia has taken rather in eastern Ukraine. And therefore, I guess, postponing any sort of induction that Ukraine will have into NATO. What is this essentially saying? It means that it's still leaving the door open for Ukraine to enter NATO within the future, whilst essentially bringing in NATO military personnel or within Ukraine and on Russia's borders directly, which is precisely the one thing that Russia has vehemently been against for the last 20 years and has been the catalyst for this particular war in the first place. So this is obviously going to be something that Russia wasn't going to accept, nor do they need to accept, because as you rightfully stated, they're pretty much winning this war, and they're doing so in the most effective way possible. So Trump's promises to his, I guess, support base that they're going to pull out of Ukraine and he's going to make one great phone call to Putin and it's going to basically resolve the issue is not practical. It's not something that the Russians are going to accept. And then this brings us on to the next point. So what is the United States supposed to do with regards to Ukraine, even under a Trump administration? Now, either you have to get, I guess, forfeit and actually concede to Russia's demands at this point, which the United States isn't going to do, or you're going to have to continue to escalate. Because what is, if they were to allow Russia essentially to prevail in this war and to gain, to come out of it, not just more militarily powerful, economically powerful, it will also embolden them in the greater scheme of things with regards to BRICS and its general global position. And that is not something you want when you're trying to preserve your global hegemony, which is, I guess, inherent to sustaining imperialism, because you need to have a unipolar world in order to sustain imperialism, because as I've said before, it's imperialism, which is the high state of capitalism, requires unipolar monopoly of capital so you can constantly extract said wealth. So if the United States under Trump was to accept Russia to have its way, that's not what's going to happen. It's going to essentially allow Russia to become triumphant, and it's going to diminish and undermine the United States' influence throughout the world, and it will allow Russia and BRICS to grow significantly, again undermining Western hegemony, and this will directly impact their ability to economically control the world and their ability to constantly profit maximize, which is essentially what they're concerned with. So Trump knows this. However, he's been sort of, I guess, declaring a different sort of rhetoric to appeal to the masses that he wants to appeal to, who are in many ways anti-globalists within their own sort of understanding of things. But he can't practically actually end the war in Ukraine. And that is why we're seeing this sort of escalation. It's not going to stop under Trump. We're going to see other small gradual escalations. Now, to what extent they will be successful is a tad bit of a different story. I don't see them being particularly successful, but they will continue to provoke escalation. And just like one last point, this can also be even further understood when you start looking at what has been happening in Ukraine since pretty much 2010. I mean, Ukraine didn't have to be in this situation to begin with. It was something that was sort of created in the first place because of Western imperialism's need to deplete, destroy Russia, and in doing so, then target China and then simultaneously all of their adversaries, so that they can sustain their global, I guess, control, and therefore their ability to extract under imperialism. Because if you go back to,
no, so just for the audience, like, all this seems like, may seem complicated, especially if you're just getting into it, but U.S. imperialism and what the U.S. strategic playbook is, it varies from region to region and conflict to conflict, but in essence, the skeleton of it, the bones of it, are the same from place to place. The U.S. is U.S. political thought is obsessed with this idea of unipolarity equaling U.S. domestic homeland security. Like, we are not safe unless we have secured our oil interests, because society would literally break down if there was any halt to the oil supply. There's an obsession, of course, with national security. There's a neoconservative expansionist bent. But the U.S. political thought, and this is beyond the scope of this conversation, is that any sort of regional, what they would call a regional hegemon, or any sort of regional power that's near peer or like challenges U.S. hegemony in any part of the world is a problem. So what do they want? What generally does the U.S. do? Sanctions, and if those don't work, popular uprising. And if those don't work, military intervention. And in the post global war on terror era, where there's really significant threats to the American military's all volunteer force because they don't have public consent to really put U.S. troops on the ground in a visible way where they'll be killed, it is gone down. So we do these proxy wars. Okay, so what we're trying to do, and this means like the U.S. government on both sides of the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans, because I don't care what rhetoric they give during their campaign speech, they both have a similar corporate capitalist agenda going on. So it's to isolate a country, starve it out with economic sanctions. Economic sanctions are meant to, destroy their ability to wage war, afford basic necessities. It's meant to punish the people into overthrowing the government. Essentially, very reductionist. If that doesn't work, there's other things that they can do: proxy wars, military intervention, strategically isolating them, cutting off trade lanes. We're seeing that with China. We're trying to isolate China. We're doing that with like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and of course, Trump wants to combat China economically, but he doesn't really have the tools to do that. Again, beyond the scope of this episode. And then Iran. Iran is not a near peer in any way. Like Russia with its somewhat large military that's being vindicated by this war recently, and its massive nuclear arsenal. And it's not like a near peer economically like China, but Iran is a regional hegemon. So what do? Try to starve them out. Sanctions, proxy interventions. You brought up Syria, and the list goes on. But it's not working anymore, and that's the problem. And it goes back to what you're saying about how they can't back down. They can't back down with Iran. They can't back down with their support of Israel against Hezbollah, Hamas, Kataib Hezbollah militias in Iraq, and the Houthis, and they can't back down in other places, Ukraine, because once they do, the game's up. They've lost face completely, and they will have lost popular consent from the American people, and they will have lost the global fear of U.S. sanctions and military interventions. So they really can't, in order to advance their imperialist interests, back down. Because again, essentially, and I think we're in agreement about this, once they do, the game's kind of up. It's kind of like, reminds me of like October 7th destroying the idea of Israeli military and intelligence and vulnerability. Like they can't get that deterrence back, even though they can try. And in a similar way, as a corollary, I don't see how, if the U.S. backs down in any of these places, especially Ukraine, because it's happened first, the game's up. The jig is literally up.
Yeah, it's rooted in really and truthfully the fact that the United States functions as a financial capitalist sort of powerhouse, where they export capital, and that's essentially how they generate their wealth, but also control the world. And they've done that, and they've rapidly deindustrialized in order to do that, because industrialization reached its peak. And from a particular point onwards, within, I guess, the capitalist mode of production, there's a tendency, like I said, of the rate of profit to fall. And once that happens, it essentially means you need to reorganize your economy in order to sustain those profits. So one way to which to one of the counter tendencies is to start exporting outward, and that's where imperialism begins to take place, and sustaining global inequality, so that you are then able to extract from the global, I guess, the poorer nations around the world, so you're able to sustain those profits and bring them back into the United States. If, however, the global South, let's just, which is sort of like the collective, like outside of the West, Western world begins now to grow economically, and they're no longer so easily able to be exploited, this changes the ability of the financial capitalists to be able to exploit and therefore sustain their, I guess, extraction, particularly the extraction that goes particularly to the 1%. And as that happens, that means they will no longer be able to keep up the facade of, I guess, a wealthy, growing economy in the United States. And that will then manifest and trickle down into the working class of the United States, who will then retaliate because they're the ones that are going to feel the grunt of that, I guess, economic decay. And so for the United States and for the imperialists to be able to continue to, I guess, masquerade, I guess, the so-called economic prosperity of the United States, which has been, like I said, predominantly financial capitalism, they need to preserve a global inequality, which means the destruction of any sort of opponent. And that is why we're seeing what we're seeing with Russia, China, Iran, even the axis of resistance in Western Asia, and pretty much anywhere and everywhere where there's opposition now to capitalism and a desire for sovereignty that is rooted in economic sovereignty, which itself is rooted in industrialization and economic prosperity. They do not want economic prosperity for the global South. And this is also part of, I guess, I think I would advise everyone to go and take a look at the GRAYZONE article, which with the leaks that they actually revealed, because the particular point of one of the, I guess, revelations within these email exchanges that were leaked was the British discussing effectively post-Putin Marshall Plan. And what that essentially means is that by trying to deplete Russia and basically bleed it dry by prolonging the war as far as possible to undermine Putin, which is why we're seeing all these minor escalations, the objective is eventually to overthrow Putin. And then a post-Putin Marshall Plan essentially means you're going to see all these financial Western capitalists take over and colonize Russia, balkanize it, essentially divided it into multiple different, countries, essentially, and extracting it of its natural resources. I mean, it's the richest resource. Yeah, it's just the richest country resources in the world, and that's what they want, effectively, among many other things. But
and you've got war hawks like Lindsey Graham going on and saying the quiet part out loud, like, you know how much lithium's in the Donbass? You want Russia to have it? It's like, okay, dude, we know we know what's going on, and just so you know, if you're not up to snuff on post World War II history, what Elina means by the Marshall Plan is General Marshall, in a kind of recovery act around 1948. It was proposed, and I think it was like 1947. It was that the United States provided economic assistance to restore the economic infrastructure of post-World War Europe, at least in the parts that the West controlled and not the Soviets, in order to basically...
that's where they make their money.
Yeah. Especially like as the contracting and defense complex kind of exploded in the post-World War II era. Like, yes, balkanizing Russia has been a plan, and installing a post-Putin neo-Marshall Plan has been something that people want to do, and operatives within both parties have been talking about for a long time. So I guess one of the problems is, and this is something we haven't really talked about, is like, yes, they won't be able to save Ukraine militarily, and the entire system is kind of, I would say, in cascade failure, because if we keep mentioning this GRAYZONE article with the leaked documents, part of that was to prepare the British public to use information operations or psyops. They enlisted like a psyops brigade. Apparently that was in the plan, to prepare the British public for a lower standard of living that comes as a result of this war in Ukraine. And it's done. It's destroyed their energy supply. It's washed
everything,
tax money out of the public sector into the private, and also because of Ukraine's agricultural output, it's also wreaked havoc within agricultural sectors throughout Europe.
Exactly. I mean, look, firstly, when you are sanctioning Russia's gas or oil, or the energy industry as a whole, which the EU and the UK to a certain extent are actually so dependent on, what you're effectively doing is raising the cost of living in everything, because the energy sector obviously is what controls the vast amount of the economy. It's the base for the economy, for any economy. It's what the economy runs on. So this is what they call in the UK the cost of living crisis. Essentially, people are just unable to even afford basic amenities. They can't even warm their houses. They struggle to get by. And the inflation has had a real chip on the real income of the average working class person. And this is sort of prevalent, not just in the UK, but throughout the EU. And we've seen what that's done to particularly Germany, that was the powerhouse of the EU, that has been completely deindustrialized. And that's also why we're seeing sort of the eradication of the labor aristocracy and a rise of the far right, also, as well as the left, and sort of an undermining of the centrist party in Germany. And this is one of the reasons why. And the other aspect, in order to just counter that, supposedly in order to support Ukraine, like you said, they've even allowed for the free trade of agricultural goods between Ukraine and the rest of the EU, which has been catastrophic for the EU farmer, for the agricultural sector within the EU. That's in addition to everything else that the EU working class has had to endure, supposedly to support this war on Russia, and that it's something, and it's been sold to them as something that has to be done in order to preserve their national security interests. And this goes back to like the great green goblin, if Putin's going to come and get everybody, and if he defeats Ukraine, he's going to take over the rest of the EU, etc. narrative. So they're trying against the PSYOP operations to persuade people that this war and their suffering is essential, although it's not particularly working anymore because the material conditions of the vast majority of the EU working class have eroded so much. But we're seeing even now, I think there's been protests happening in France. Farmers' protests are happening again. This is in addition to the other grand EU farmers' protests that were happening this time again last year, because now the EU is looking towards making these particular deals and agreements with certain African countries in order to import, I guess, agricultural produce, obviously at a cheaper, or having more free flows of agricultural produce from the African continent. However, this creates a problem. And the reason this creates a problem is very similar to why it created a problem when we were getting agricultural goods and grains from Ukraine. That being, the regulations used within Europe and the sort of standards of produce is significantly different than that which is executed in Ukraine and within, the general African continent, which means that for the average working class farmer in the EU, they have certain standards that they have to abide by that are incredibly expensive in order to be able to produce and sell on the European market. However, those standards do not apply to Ukraine or the African continent because they're not part of the EU. So they're able to produce using different standards, cheaper standards, and then those are able to sell those agricultural grain products into the EU for far cheaper, underscoring the agricultural sector in the EU and the EU farmer, meaning that these people who are already suffering, a cost of living crisis, inflation, and like an erosion of their real income are now going to have to compete with far cheaper goods coming from non-EU states. And this is directly threatening their livelihood. And they're being told that this has to be accepted because we need to defeat Russia. And one last small thing, actually, I think it was just a couple of days ago when the foreign minister of Germany, I forgot her name, Annalena Baerbock, I keep forgetting how to pronounce her name, so my apologies for that. She's of the Green Party in Germany. I mean, she was conducting an interview in Germany, and what she had essentially said was, I think something like 37 billion had been taken from the German taxpayer and from welfare gets policies that they were going to implement in Germany and placed in Ukraine. And she was trying to, I guess, coax the German working class to believe that that should be acceptable because it's necessary for their survival. In the meantime, the average German person is seeing a huge hit to their life and to their overall living conditions, and they're being told that they have to accept that. This is why we're seeing such a polarization in the politics taking place throughout the EU, particularly in Western Europe. And that's just going to continue to escalate because clearly the West, as we've seen with the particular leaks that came out, with the GRAYZONE, but also their policies, which kind of adhere to what that particular article actually reveals, they're going to continue to escalate, and they're going to try to stretch this as far as possible, not because Ukraine can win, but they're trying as much as possible to undermine Putin. This is the grand objective. Because also when you look at Russian politics and what's going on in Russia, the Russian people want this war to be over. And Putin has said that he will have this sorted within the next, like by 2025 maximum. So, you know, there is also a pressure on Putin to wrap this up. And this is why the West wants to try to escalate and not
at least keep it going.
Undermine him. Yeah.
At least keep it going. Again, for that reason, because there's just a faint hope in a popular revolution. Not going to happen. If it was going to happen, it would have happened like 6 months in, 8 months in, when Russia was taking massive losses. But now they're in a pretty stable position. They're making gains. But again, they're going to keep hoping, delusional, magical thinking that there's going to be a popular revolution or a palace coup or the Russian military is going to collapse or something. In the meantime, ATACM's not really going to help anything, but they can't back down. We've explained why they can't back down, and because they don't really care about the working class, the people who make these decisions, the political and corporate elites that are basically behind this war, shaping policy. Not really too concerned about the working class, so conditions will continue to degrade, and it's a cascade failure, like a complete societal and political cascade failure that we're witnessing in real time. So, yeah, I guess closing.
It's exactly what you've said. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Oh
no, go ahead. I think I'm lagging.
Sorry, I think I was lagging. Yeah, I just want to say I just completely agree with you. Basically, you know, they're going to. I think the West went into this war having miscalculated, I guess, the position that Russia was in, its military capabilities, its economic significance in terms of global trade, BRICS, its alliances that it had established. Because this is the thing, Russia had been preparing itself for this potential war for the better part of at least 10 years. Because for anybody that was sort of following what was occurring within Ukraine and the overall, I guess, gradual escalation, because this is the thing, this has been a gradual escalation since at least 2008. So we knew this time was coming. Putin was aware of this. And so they built, and even the economic self-sufficiency of Russia, that was not factored in the way that they should have. I mean, all these sanctions didn't work because Russia has become an economically self-sufficient country. And so this is a grand, you could say, miscalculation, but it also boils down to the fact that the imperialists are desperate to retain control. This is what it is. And if they don't do it now, at the very least, if they even escalate to direct conflict with Russia, well, the way they perceive it, it's fine. We can, even if we will be hurt, we will hurt them equally as much and try to deter the entire axis, as they call it, of evil. That would include China, Russia, and Iran. At least we can, if they will take a hit, well, we're going to impose on them also a sort of drastic hit that will impede on their ability to develop. This is sort of the state of affairs that we're currently at.
Yeah. And, you know, it kind of, in closing, reminds me of, you know, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, his complete, like, personal political strategy, which is to do all those things, to deter, to be violent, and also to just keep playing for time to hope that somehow the political landscape will change, which it won't. But, you know, what else are you going to do? So, yeah, personally, I don't think this is going to be like the Flashpoint of World War III, but, you know, it's another rung on the escalation ladder. North Korea is now more involved. Iran has solidified a security relationship with Russia. There was the BRICS summit, which was kind of groundbreaking in a lot of ways, but it will take some time for that to, like, flesh out completely. But these powers and these relationships that are adversarial to each other, you know, a multipolar world and a unipolar world, the lines are kind of being drawn in a way that's uncomfortable looking at it. Because look, what happened leading up to the First World War, no one expected it. it was completely unprecedented. What happened leading up to the Second World War, unprecedented. Some people were expecting it, but also thought it was going to remain regional. And then, who knows what those look like will look different from a potential Third World War. So we're just warning about it. There's a lot of brinksmanship happening that shouldn't be happening. And I don't think anyone's going to back down, because from everyone's perspective, they can't afford to. So is it going to happen today? No, but this has been building for years, and this could keep building for years until finally a flashpoint happens. And then, well, hope you got a bunker or something, because it's going to get gnarly. So I think that's we're kind of out of time. I'm glad we were able to do kind of like a roundtable of all these issues surrounding the war in Ukraine and Biden's decision to allow U.S. missiles into the Russian heartland. Also, the fact that, Trump probably won't change anything, or at least not in any tangible way that would, end hostilities forever. So, Elina Xenofontos, thank you as always so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, guys, this kind of went a lot longer. Well, longer than I expected. So apologies, no live Q&A, but I promise to try and make it up to you Thursday. So how about that? Huh? All right. Cheers, guys. This has been State of Play on Mint Press News. If you're coming through Colonial Outcast, please consider subscribing to Mint Press News. It's not just me. There's also a lot of talented individuals who create content that's well worth consuming. All right. Cheers, y'all. World's not